It was 4 a.m., and I had come to what I thought was the end of a long and emotionally exhausting day. I had just managed to fall asleep when I was abruptly awakened by the sound of pounding on the front door. Still half asleep, I stumbled to my feet and opened the bedroom door. To my surprise, the house was full of police, one of whom was halfway up the stairs shouting, "Sir, do you have a weapon? Let me see your hands," or something like that. It's hard to recall exactly, given I was still half asleep at the time. "What time is it anyway?" 5 a.m., sir." Wow, it's hard to believe it had barely been an hour since my initial encounter with police. "Try to get some sleep, sir," was the last thing I remember the police saying before they left the first time. "Is there anyone else in the house?" "No, officer, just my wife and I." Hoping to preempt having to give yet another drawn-out dissertation, I asked one of the officers if he had a report of the 911 call my wife placed an hour earlier. "Yes, sir. We understand 2 officers were dispatched to your home." I continued to make my way down the stairs into the living room, where my wife was sitting on the couch surrounded by police. As I continued to explain the situation, my wife became visibly upset, shouting frantically, "My husband and his friends are trying to kill me." As my wife's accusations grew increasingly bizarre, it became more and more apparent to police and paramedics that this was not a case of domestic violence, as my wife had emphatically alleged. In fact, over the past 48 hours, I watched helplessly as my wife's psychological demeanor quickly devolved into yet another full-blown manic crisis. A crisis facilitated by her doctor's latest attempt to wean her off of her psychiatric medication. My wife has never accepted her diagnosis and sought out her current doctor because of his unorthodox therapeutic approach. She was enamored with his opposition to psychiatric medications. However, he struck me more as a modern-day witch doctor, as opposed to a competent psychiatrist. After a serious crisis my wife suffered 3 years earlier, neither I nor her former doctor were supportive of her continued plans to taper or discontinue her medication. Consequently, she promptly changed doctors and excluded me from being involved in anything remotely related to her mental health. She and her new doctor kept me completely out of the loop, except of course when I alone was left to pick up the pieces, following yet another of his failed attempts. Nevertheless, my wife remained undaunted, despite her having to be hospitalized nearly half a dozen times in as few as 3 years. In fact, her doctor himself was incessantly relentless, with no apparent regard for the consequences of his prescribed treatment. Faced with crisis after crisis after crisis, both secular and Christian counselors alike suggested legal separation or divorce. The truth is, I genuinely loved my wife, and despite the bleak outlook, I labored diligently to salvage what I could of my embattled marriage. Of course, our marriage wasn't always this beleaguered. In fact, the first 3 years of our marriage was like a made-for-TV love story. While things weren't always perfect, they were, for the most part, always good, although lately those days seem so far off. My wife has since abandoned our home and marriage to pursue her life's passion to be medication-free. Ironically, despite her illness, the vast majority of the times we shared were blessed. I pray these precious memories will endure, memories we would not have otherwise shared. During this long and painful drama, I've come to accept the fact that real-life love stories don't always end with, "and they lived happily ever after." In the end, we do well if we manage to find enough happiness to sustain us along the way. This, of course, doesn't make these situations any less painful, but it does make the pain a bit more tolerable. Sadly, many of us go through life suffering in silence. We endure hardship in obscurity, crying only when it rains. However, as a man of faith, I'm convinced that our adversities are intended to be shared. That is to say, the lessons we learn are not meant for us alone, but also for those burdened with similar challenges. If we fail to share what we've learned, then sadly, our suffering is in vain. I've learned to make it a point to take time out when life begins to feel a bit upside down. I occasionally find peace of mind in day-long bike rides along the tranquil and scenic trails of the C&O Canal. I can honestly say I would not have endured the post-traumatic stress following my wife's second major crisis, or retained any meaningful measure of sanity in dealing with the crippling anxiety of anticipating her next, if not for these much-needed times to reflect, to regroup, and to commune with God. I remember hearing somewhere, in the event of sudden decompression, you should first secure your own breathing apparatus before attempting to assist others. I find this principle is also true in life. My wife and I were both members of a popular Christian singles ministry and originally met on an afternoon lunch cruise. Because we both expressed an interest in horseback riding, the ministry director suggested we work together to plan a horseback riding trip for the group's next outing. I, of course, saw this as a great opportunity for us to get better acquainted. After a few weeks of exchanging emails and phone calls, we made plans to go out for coffee and a light meal. I suggested an open mic poetry cafe I frequented. The evening went great, so much so that I proposed that we see one another exclusively. That night she shared with me that she was taking medication for what she described as a chemical imbalance. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, many people are taking medication for some ailment or another. High blood pressure, diabetes, you name it. Besides, I was already love-struck, and as it turned out, her mental health would not become a major issue for us until 3 years or so well into our marriage. Relatively speaking, it's only recently that the cumulative weight of these crises have begun to take their toll. My wife and I had several weeks of extensive premarital counseling, touching on virtually every topic imaginable, from race to finance. Ironically, none of our sessions ever touched on anything remotely related to mental health. Consequently, I did not fully comprehend the width, breadth, or depth of my wife's illness. Still, it's difficult to say if additional counseling would have made any difference with respect to our marriage plans, especially given my optimistic predisposition and chronic propensity to hope. But hope deferred can make the heart grow sick. Endorphins do a body good like medicine. The trouble was, my pituitary couldn't produce enough of this natural stress fighter fast enough on its own to keep up. Consequently, biking, running, hanging out with friends, taking in a good movie, and spending time in the garden were my life or flotation device. Because God knows I was never good at treading water. One only needs to Google the phrase, stress kills, to unlock a plethora of articles and clinical studies attesting to the real-life dangers prolonged stress has on both one's mental and physical well-being. Stress kills isn't merely a cute catchphrase, but a sobering warning I've learned to take quite seriously. I realized I was in a fierce bout with mental illness, and stress had me on the ropes. Eventually, I was urged by family and friends to seek help as my symptoms of chronic stress were becoming more apparent to those around me. Regular exercise and dietary supplements helped, and an occasional sleeping aid got me through many a restless night, but still overwhelmed by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, I frequently wrestled with depression and was often taunted by the age-old question, to be or not to be. I would eventually find the encouragement and support I so desperately needed amongst those who genuinely understood my plight, having themselves walked in my shoes. NAMI was a godsend. The local chapter I attended was a combination of family caregivers as well as individuals who themselves were diagnosed with a mental illness or working through a mental health issue, like myself. This group's unique composition provided valuable insight from vantage points and perspectives that I would never have otherwise had the opportunity to consider. I still recall the first night I ventured through the doors and the group's facilitator shared the challenges she faced in dealing with her own son's mental illness. However, at the time, some of the advice she shared seemed counterintuitive because I wasn't quite there yet. In other words, I would have to learn the hard way that I could not love my wife well, and no amount of wishful thinking on my part would give her the insight to accept or recognize her need. The truth is, she would have to get to that point on her own. Make no mistake, this process was a long and painful one, but at least now I had some help, and the National Alliance on Mental Illness would prove to be an invaluable resource. It's been said, the devil is always in the details, which was most certainly true in our case. Not a member of, nor subject to any medical ethics association, cash and carry psychiatrists, such as the one supposedly treating my wife, ultimately do far more harm than good, driven solely by their ideology. They take no responsibility for the carnage and dismembered lives they leave in their wake. They peddle their wares in the shadows well beneath the radar with virtual impunity. So let the buyers beware and their loved ones be wary. In our case, my wife's doctor was so astute with the inner workings of the system that he frequently hid behind the obscure cloak of doctor-patient privilege. Consequently, meticulous documentation in conjunction with corroborating evidence was key in comprising a compelling complaint, especially given this doctor's tendency to equivocate when confronted by police or scrutinized by his peers regarding my wife's treatment. Initially faced with such a daunting challenge, I was tempted to throw up my hands and do nothing. However, I subsequently felt morally compelled to act, if too late for the sake of my own marriage, perhaps not too late for the sake of someone else's. I understand and appreciate my wife's right to choose her own doctor. However, I'm certain there are fundamental standards and guidelines to which any competent medical practitioner must adhere. I also appreciate my wife's right to privacy. However, this privilege is not intended to exempt practitioners from responsibility, oversight, or review with respect to concerns regarding their professional judgment or competence. My primary complaint with my wife's doctor is that he consistently undermines the treatment prescribed by hospital psychiatrists once she has been stabilized and subsequently discharged. I realize that not all licensed psychiatrists subscribe to traditional forms of treatment, preferring instead to focus on dietary supplements and talk therapy. However, my wife has not responded well to this doctor's repeated tapering of her psychiatric medication. In every instance, his treatment has resulted in my wife's mental decomposition and subsequent hospitalization. Despite his repeated failures, he persists with little or no regard for the ensuing consequences. He and my wife share the same fundamental ideology with respect to their common disdain for all psychiatric medications. However, as a licensed medical practitioner, it's my understanding that this doctor's treatment of my wife should not be determined by his own personal bias, or ideology, but rather by his greater moral and ethical obligation to do no harm. My wife and I have been separated for more than a year now, during which time I never missed her birthday, our anniversary, or any opportunity to send a card and gift, or simply a word of encouragement. I'm eternally grateful for the prayers offered on my wife's behalf by family, friends, and even strangers. In all of our 8+ years of marriage, I never discounted God's ability to heal my wife through prayer. In fact, I'm persuaded that God has already provided for my wife's healing through the medication she refuses to take. Yes, I do believe in miracles. In fact, I've seen many. Like Jonah, time and again, God has rescued my wife from certain harm and even death. However, God never violates her will. He rescues her and brings her back to a point of decision. But unlike Jonah, my wife still refuses to go to Nineveh. And no amount of compromise on my part can compensate for her unwilling heart, despite the fact that I still love her dearly. I was so looking forward to a quiet weekend amidst the colorful backdrop of autumn, overlooking the Shenandoah Valley atop the majestic Blue Ridge Mountains. A weekend retreat my wife and I had taken on many occasions. This year, however, I would make the trek alone, hoping to find some degree of closure. Over these past few months, I've seen so many of our plans and dreams fade and wither like the autumn leaves, carried off by the shifting winds of a season I can barely recognize. Why is it winter never seems to wait its turn? My wife recently filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Nevertheless, her parents have been graciously supportive through this ordeal, not only concerning their beloved daughter, but regarding me as well. It's evident that our unfortunate situation breaks their hearts, yet to some degree they too have had to learn to let go. I've been told that most husbands in my situation would breathe a sigh of relief over the prospect of divorce. However, I'm not overcome with elation, but with profound sadness. Divorce is for me as emotionally devastating as the death of a loved one. In this case, however, there would be no opportunity for a sense of closure that might come through the rituals and formalities of a traditional memorial. Consequently, I found myself mentally and emotionally adrift. When I was encouraged to speak with a grief counselor, I felt it's rather odd to seek bereavement counseling over the death of my marriage. However, after thinking it over, I felt it certainly couldn't hurt to chat with a therapist for a session or two at the most. 5 months and more than a dozen sessions later, I could finally begin to see the light. It still amazes me that something as simple as a random memory or faded photograph can evoke tears. I confess even now I find myself teary-eyed when I think about my wife. Through counseling, however, I've come to accept the fact that crying is simply a natural part of the grieving process. In a recent BeliefNet article, Therese Bolchar quoted New York Times reporter Benedict Curry as characterizing tears as emotional perspiration. Without question, those of us overwhelmed with the extraordinarily difficult challenges of caring for a loved one wrestling with a mental illness can certainly use a good emotional workout. After all, it's been said, crying does a body good like medicine. Well, not exactly. Nevertheless, some would argue that a good long healthy cry is still just what the doctor ordered. In fact, Bolchar asserts that crying can actually elevate our mood, reducing anxiety, irritability, fatigue, aggression, and a host of other adverse emotional dispositions. It's also been reported that crying can reduce stress by eliminating excessive levels of endorphins. In stark contrast, however, suppressing our tears can actually increase our stress levels. For sure, laughter is not without its own benefits, but for now, go ahead and have a good, long, healthy cry. Even Jesus wept. Of course, the challenge is in knowing when it's time to stop. In an article entitled Hobbies and Mental Health, David Ditch cites an inpatient mental health facility in the UK. He notes that therapists in this facility noticed a marked improvement in the mental health and overall well-being of those patients who developed and engaged in hobbies. If this is true for those diagnosed with a mental illness, then how much more is this the case for those of us who love and care for them? Some years ago, I had become so overwhelmed with stress that my actions were becoming just as irrational as those of my wife in the throes of a major crisis. If left unchecked, I would have been in no condition to help myself, let alone my wife, if or when the opportunity did arise. Instinctively, I thought it was my responsibility to rescue my wife from the consequences of her own actions. On the brink of mental and emotional exhaustion, I was forced to come to terms with the fact that I was not my wife's savior. No, that job was light years beyond my pay grade and ability, which would explain my dismal performance review. Consequently, I would have to learn to let go. Much more than a hobby, acting was for me a passion that provided a much-needed emotional diversion, because as is true in life, the show must go on. My wife and I both shared a love for animals and took a special interest in a colony of cats who had taken up residency in the woods behind our home. Over the course of 2 years, we would capture and socialize Felix, Precious, Hope, Joy, Charity, Buddy, Sammy Blue, Val and Victoria, Buttercup, and so on. Before it was all said and done, we had fostered nearly 24 furry felines. Without exaggeration, this was truly a monumental task, but nonetheless enriching. Amongst the last group of strays to be brought out of the cold were 4 timid kittens and their nursing mother, whom we affectionately named Mercedes, because she frequently slept beneath our neighbor's Mercedes. Eventually, she and all but one of her kittens were surrendered to one of several no-kill shelters, where I'm confident most were eventually adopted into warm and loving homes. The cute little kitten I was compelled to keep we named Fluffy, for obvious reasons. Besides, after naming nearly 24 cats, we were low on creativity in the cat name department. Although she was the runt of the litter, Fluffy soon became my closest and dearest companion, following my wife's abrupt abandonment. Initially used in a mental health facility, and again by the American Red Cross and military convalescent care, the Animal Health Foundation notes that pets as therapeutic partners is a valued approach in both the physical and psychosocial arena. Lawrence Robinson and Gene Siegel point out that while most pet owners are clear about the immediate joys that come with sharing their lives with companion animals, many remain unaware of the physical and mental health benefits that accompany the pleasures of playing with or snuggling up to a furry friend. The two also assert that recent studies affirm that pet owners are less likely to suffer from depression than are their non-pet owning counterparts. In addition, playing with a pet can elevate levels of serotonin and dopamine, which calm and soothe us when we're stressed. As I navigate the difficult challenges of life, I'm reminded, while God isn't responsible for causing the adversity in our lives, He does at times permit it. However, God will never let the suffering of the faithful go to waste. Paul of Tarsus describes the suffering of the saints as momentary light afflictions. Yet it's from an eternal perspective that the apostle legitimately characterizes our suffering as momentary or light. In fact, I must frequently remind myself that our present suffering is not worthy to compare to the glory that will be revealed in us. Right now, however, that's difficult to see. Nevertheless, I'm compelled to believe it. When I find myself immersed in hardship, I'm reminded, don't forget to breathe. That is to say, don't allow the cares and troubles of this life to so overwhelm us that we forget to take or make the time to enjoy life. However brief, life is a gift we should live, not simply endure. We all at some time or another will find ourselves doing all we can just to keep our heads above water, tossed by the violent waves of circumstance. Even the strongest of swimmers can find themselves caught in the rip currents of life and in desperate need of rescue. It's especially in times like these we can't forget to breathe. Holding our breath underwater is instinctive. However, even at modest depths, the pressures exerted on the most seasoned of divers could make this seemingly innocuous instinct potentially fatal. I imagine the same could be said of the pressures of everyday life. Life's journey has taken my wife and me to many interesting places. Sadly, it's taken us to many painful places as well. Still, I always assumed we would both grow old together. And despite it all, I still prayed our marriage might have endured even this. In illustrating our story, I had purposed simply to share whatever insight I might have gleaned along the way. Yet mine is not a 12-step formula. In fact, it's doubtful you found this book in the self-help aisle of any Barnes & Noble, because frankly, it's not about self-help. Some think it odd that I would not consider myself to be a religious man. In fact, to some degree, I've developed an aversion for the term religious. Similarly, spiritual is far too generic a term than I would care to use. However, as a man of the way, mine has been an extraordinary journey, and I've discovered many incredibly helpful tools for coping with my wife's illness. Still, for someone barely treading water, these tools provide only marginal buoyancy. The fact is, nothing I did actually changed my circumstances. What did change, however, was my perspective. In the end, I have been stretched far beyond what I believed to have been my breaking point. And to some degree, I have in fact been broken. God has gotten my full attention in ways He would not have otherwise. Through this drama, God has increased my faith in ways He could not have otherwise. By God's grace, I'm still learning to persevere despite the difficulties and setbacks life throws my way. Although I may be afflicted in every way, I am not crushed. Although I am perplexed, I won't despair. Although I am cast down, I'm not destroyed. If through my life's drama I've learned nothing else, I have learned this. However brief, life is a gift we should live, not simply endure. So regardless of what the future holds, I will remain stubbornly committed to living life to its fullest. So help me God.